There are two main stages in the development of every modern treaty: negotiation and implementation. This episode focuses on the Government of Canada's role in negotiation. Negotiation of modern treaties is managed by one federal department, currently called Crown-Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada, or CIRNAC. This department has teams of negotiators and support staff involved in multiple negotiations across Canada. Throughout the negotiations process, CIRNAC consults with many other departments to inform the negotiations, but only CIRNAC representatives negotiate.
Our work involves representing Canada at over 150 negotiation tables that are from coast to coast to coast. Those tables represent over 500 Indigenous communities with about 1 million Indigenous people represented. At those tables, the work that we're doing is primarily related to the dialogue on how we can co-develop approaches to not just recognize, but to truly implement the inherent rights and title of Indigenous peoples, as well as to support the self-determination of Indigenous peoples.
Negotiations often take decades, involving teams of staff and lawyers. Until recently, Indigenous organizations borrowed millions from the Government of Canada to finance their participation. This huge financial burden was removed in 2019 when Canada committed to reimburse all paid negotiation loans, forgive unpaid balances, and finance current and future negotiations. How do modern treaty negotiations look from the perspective of the Government of Canada? Federal negotiators represent the interests of Canada at the negotiating table, but also must find ways to reach a deal that is acceptable to the Indigenous negotiators. Compromise is required. Also, to keep negotiations moving, federal negotiators must often educate their colleagues in the huge federal bureaucracy about the realities of life in Indigenous communities and the reasons for certain sections in a treaty.
The most challenging part of my job is recognizing that I work in a very large organization that has many, many parts to it, the federal government. And while certainly the treaties have a definite purpose and a definite objective, it's hard sometimes to kind of get that objective across to an evolving federal government with many, many thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in it. So making sure that we continue to educate the rest of the federal government as to what treaties mean, and making sure that we're all kind of rowing in the same direction and recognizing what the purpose of the treaties are, that for me is still the big challenge.
As you might expect, relationships between federal and Indigenous negotiators can be tense and confrontational at times, but they are usually respectful and polite.
We need to be able to work together each and every day to fulfill the agreement and the obligations in those agreements. But of course, it's also important to understand that we may not always agree on everything. And there's nothing wrong about that. For me, what's really important is that we disagree in a way that's respectful and that allows us to be able to start the next day to deal with the next set of issues that are going to come along.
You do walk in there with the weight of feeling the crown on your shoulders and making sure you want to make sure that crown interests are captured. But you also have to have an open mind enough, I think, to understand that the crown doesn't have all the interests here. The crown has to move in some areas. And in some cases, maybe the crown is misinformed or wrong with its approach. So how negotiations sometimes unfold, it's important that you have at a table, you have a particular dialogue at a table. But one of the things I've found that's really important about negotiations are the discussions you have away from the table. When you need to pull somebody aside from the table and say, look, this is not working for that reason, maybe we should try this approach. And be able to have that kind of trust you might have with an individual or a couple of folks from the other, across the table from you, away from the table, so there's less of a show. So if you can kind of build up that trust and build up that understanding, that's really, really helpful for negotiations to have frank and honest dialogues, sometimes away from the table.
As federal negotiators and Indigenous partners come together at the table, they explore new ways of reaching agreements that recognize and implement the rights of Indigenous peoples. The discussion begins with both parties outlining potential topics and their interests for the negotiation. The parties then co-develop key components and parameters that inform a negotiation mandate. This new way of approaching negotiations, that is more respectful of the interests of all parties, has resulted in significant uptake amongst Indigenous partners and has yielded numerous agreements.
I think our approach to negotiations are changing a bit in the federal government. In the past, we would get a mandate from cabinet and then defend that mandate at the table. And that became kind of an adversarial relationship. I think now we're moving more to an interest-based negotiation, more of a co-developed type style of negotiations.
The terms of modern treaties have changed over time. When Indigenous organizations asserted their rights in the 1960s, the federal government denied those rights. Since then, multiple legal precedents and the ratification of Canada's Constitution, i.e. Section 35, have established the rights of Indigenous peoples not only to their land but also to self-government. Along the way, negotiators have adapted, which is why, for example, all modern treaties signed after 2000 include self-government provisions. At the heart of the treaty relationship is the legal phrase "honor of the Crown," which means the Crown is responsible for making sure its obligations are met in an honorable and ethical manner. The Crown must take into account not just the strictly legal interpretations of modern treaties, but also their spirit and intent. When federal negotiators sit down at modern treaty negotiation or implementation review tables, their actions must uphold the honor of the Crown.
Negotiations can be very frustrating. Everybody goes into that room passionate about doing the best thing. Everybody goes into that room wanting a better Canada. But you also go into that room with very different histories, very different hopes for the future sometimes, and a very different understanding of how to get there. And making sure, especially if you're working for the federal and provincial government, that you really know what the Indigenous partners want, what their dreams are, what their fears are, and how to work to make those things happen, while at the same time making good on the mandates that you have representing the provincial and federal government. That's, to me, the magic in this. It's been the most complicated set of things that I've ever done in my career. Sometimes the most frustrating, but for sure the most rewarding and the thing that will last the longest after my career is over.
The job of a federal negotiator is complex, requiring the ability to work in true partnership with Indigenous communities and provincial or territorial counterparts, while remaining aligned with federal interests and upholding the honor of the Crown. A federal negotiator works hard to understand and accommodate all perspectives at the table and works collaboratively with partners to co-develop negotiation parameters to inform final agreements that recognize and implement the rights of Indigenous peoples. At some negotiation tables, these flexible agreements can evolve into a signed treaty or self-government agreement that is ready for the implementation stage.